Hello, today we will talk about almost the most popular Primarch in the Warhammer world, Lion L. Johnson. Why almost? Well, because that niche has already been occupied by Roboute Guilliman, that is, the Primarch of the Ultramarines. The Lord of the First holds the honourable second place in the ranking of awesome Primarchs, according to the opinion of fans. Among the people, Lion L. Johnson is also known simply as the Lion, the most introverted Primarch of all introverts. In any unclear situation, to get out of it, the Lion will try to hit you from under heavy cover, and may even stab you with any sharp object. Context of the events doesn't matter. The Lion might do this during a heated argument. This tactic was cleverly adopted by his descendants, the Dark Angels. Thus, it's better if the Flesh Tearers come to the rescue. Someone will have to share the flank with the First Legion. It would be fair to note that the Lion is an excellent tactician, who, according to various sources, could rival even Horus, which is partly almost true. A not bad duelist, but jumping ahead honestly, the Lion didn't defeat anyone, not fairly speaking either. He once emotionally took down his mentally ill colleague Conrad Kurz, but that doesn't count. Essentially, Lion L. Johnson embodies the canonical Primarch of a canonical order in the canonical Warhammer. After all, as we know, the Astartes were conceived as a monastic order in space, teeming with cathedrals and various kinds of secrets, and coincidentally that's exactly the kind of place where our hero was raised. Considering some discrepancies pointed out by aficionados, which we will talk about later, it's worth noting the main specialization of Lion is the destruction of monsters. If, into Leman Russ, the Emperor instilled the ability to somehow control and even influence the Primarchs, when they were a step away from heresy, and help them find the path of truth, it should be considered that even with such a formidable nickname as the Emperor's Executioner, there were operations in which honour and conscience would not allow Leman Russ to participate. And that's where the Lord of the First steps onto the scene. In the Lion, there was embedded the function to annihilate anyone whom the Emperor so desired, without posing unnecessary questions. Lion L. Johnson was an eradicator tasked with removing all evidence of the existence of those who crossed the Imperium and about whom it was now necessary for all to forget. Lion was not named in honour of an English poet, Lionel Pigott Johnson, who wrote the poem The Dark Angel, which inspired the Games Workshop to create our beloved Primarch. One day, it was by fate's design, or perhaps a programmed capsule, that Lion L. Johnson ended up on Caliban, a death world that was very closely located to the essence of horror, Segmentum Obscurus. I believe it's clear to everyone what such a neighbourhood entails. Of course, it meant forests preserve abundant, which were filled with various kinds of wildlife, but the harmony of the creatures did not last long, as the first human settlers landed on Caliban. Even though they arrived 5,000 years before the Eye of Terror appeared, it was already understood that there was something amiss with the planet. The entire fauna of this world seemed to be governed by a singular perverted mind, which harboured a deep hatred for humanity and wished for its destruction. And to some extent, it succeeded. As befits all ancient settlers, the new inhabitants of Caliban eventually squandered all their technological marvels from the dark age of technology, degenerated to medieval knights with bolter weapons and ancient power armours and intelligent horses. Moreover, there was equality, permitting even women to become knights, regardless of them being physically weaker than men, which very likely had something to do with the intelligent horses. One such knight trained Luther, and perhaps it was she who influenced his personality, which in principle explains a lot now. But I digress again. Apart from the strong and independent medieval representatives of techno-knighthood, Caliban also harboured great beasts, the most dangerous representatives of the local fauna. They were so perilous that they even stood a chance of exterminating all of humanity residing there. Before these chances had vanished completely, a capsule with a Primarch fell on Caliban. How peculiar it is, an infant named Lion L. Johnson managed to survive such dangerous proximity in the first days of his life. Perhaps this involved the Emperor's intervention, who might have imbued the Primarch with a repellent field, or maybe someone was watching over him all this while. Leman Russ and Sanguinius came to people on their own, or at least piqued their interest enough to take in the wonder child themselves. However, he, brace yourselves, spent an entire decade in complete solitude. Sanguinius crossed an entire continent-sized desert in 12 months to save his people. That is, to meet the folk of pure blood. Lemon Russ turned over many a chicken and sheep on Fenris, until the Fenrisian king's special forces took an interest in this criminal. But not Lion. Here we have two theories. First, Lion had slight deviations, and the task of emerging to human society within 10 years was insurmountable for him. The second theory is that he was so utterly self-absorbed that he had no need for humans, and had been living alone for 3 years, completely satisfied with this arrangement. But this did not last long. The aforementioned Luther, who worked in the Order, was conducting another raid to destroy yet another great beast, when suddenly this merry group only found its corpse. Who could have gotten ahead of them, Luther wondered, as something swept over their heads. Firing in the same direction with a bolt gun, they wounded a blonde orangutan, slightly larger than Luther himself. While everyone speculated on the exotic soup that could be prepared from this large and very fatty simian, Luther could discern beneath the grimy face the visage of a large, well-built human with youthful features, hairless on all parts but the head. And here I want to make a small interjection, as this description, though partially modified by me, was taken from the last book of Luther, First of the Fallen, because earlier depictions in lore slightly differed. Once upon a time, long ago, when Necrons were still envisioned as soulless killers and the Emperor wasn't portrayed with such contempt, Luther didn't find a giant child but rather a boy who appeared to be about 10 years old. Lion was named so in honour of his yellow hair, which was only on his head, and Lion L. Johnson means in Calibanite, son of the forest. Nonetheless, 10 years for a Primarch is a very, very long time. Vulcan, within 4 years of his life, became the most famous smith of Nocturne, freed his homeworld not from the Dark Angels, but the Eldar, and had already met with the Emperor. And a couple of years later he was already commanding a legion. What is the Lion doing at this time? Right, he's falling off a branch under gunfire. There runs a theory about a sleeping Primarch that the Emperor embedded a secret mechanism which protects the Primarch from the greedy hands of Xenos or any other threat, and that some of the Emperor's children's traits are activated at different life stages. Thus we have doctoral scholars like Perturabo, who could talk and craft from the first minutes of his life, Kurz and Angron, who made a couple of kills in the first hours of their lives, and hypothetical infants Gilliman and Fulgrim, who were helpless children that survived only because of other people. Validation of a very old but youthfully appearing Primarch can be corroborated by the legend of Caliban, who for over 100 years depicts a little boy wandering the local forests, leaving mysterious tracks behind. There exists the possibility that the Emperor himself safeguarded the Lion, vigilantly observing him from afar. Yet, with equal likelihood, we could hypothesize that the Emperor was testing the future master of the Dark Angels, as Lion L. Johnson found himself stranded within the enemy realm of the Chaos Gods. Presently we speak not only of the beasts twisted by the warp, but also of the demon voices that whispered promises and threats to him, confidences he shared with no one but Conrad Kurz during rare moments of nostalgia amidst their clashes. The close male company in the Order, as depicted in the early books, lacked any female presence. Yet it resulted in a tight-knit friendship between Luther and Lion. Their relationship was one of comradeship rather than paternal. Luther saw Lion as a brother. If every Primarch had, as a standard feature, an infinite charm that drove everyone to madness and led them into the depths of hell following the demigod, then it seems Lion's personality lacks this feature. He continued to lead an ascetic and reclusive life, yet Luther compensated for this deficit with his charisma. At some point this duo appeared as one entity. It could be said that each complemented the other's shortcomings. If one was the brain, the other was the heart and the specialist in public relations. However, only Lion managed to rise to the position of Supreme Grand Master of the chapter. And although he disregarded this title, it deeply stung Luther, as it was he who had long aspired to this position, yet he kept his discontent hidden. Luther harboured no sentiments at that moment. he acted rational and merely pitied the blonde-haired Mowgli. At some point they were struck by the brilliant idea to rid Caliban of the great beasts by organizing a grand planetary hunt. And this idea was well received by all. However, everyone understood perfectly well that they would not be able to cope with the forces of a single chapter on their own. They needed allies. And if you think it was the Primarch who unified the entire planet in a singular effort to rid the world of warp mutants, you are gravely mistaken. Ironically enough, it was indeed Luther who played a significant part in this endeavor. In fact, Lion was extremely fortunate to have met Luther in his life, for without him, he would have spent his days on Caliban. To some extent, Luther understood that part of the success Lion achieved was due to his work. But, as we remember, by his nature, Lion L. Johnson was quite the unpleasant figure and never paid attention to such trifles as others' feelings. He never understood other people at all. It felt as if, even after hundreds of years of existence, amidst hundreds of thousands of his sons, he continued to live alone in the forest. Orchestrating a real extermination of the great beasts, Lion personally killed so many, no one kept count anymore, including 2 Calibanite lions. He killed one with his bare hands and another one with the help of the Psyker Zahariel, the main hero of the book Descent of Angels. He helped not just as a decoy which distracted the monster, but thanks to the ability, Terrasight, which slows time and allows finding a weakness in one's prey. The great beasts had become such a nuisance, and Luther, as expected, did such a good job with the electorate, that they all followed the lion, hoping to extinguish all monsters. All, but not everyone. The Knights of Lupus declared that slaughtering the beasts was wrong. They too were living beings, and even defied the non-aggression pact by slaughtering a scouting group of the chapter, thus signing their own death warrant. In general, they were the only ones who opposed the chapter and its approach to the environment, even keeping a couple of mutants in hopes of restoring their population. The Knights of Lupus were akin to a gathering of conservatives fearful of change. Lion did not particularly like when things did not go according to plan, and silently went on to strike down the traditionalists. The battle was fiercely and bloody, losses were incurred on both sides, but the chapter had not just Hexagrammaton, but a whole Primarch on its side. Under his command, the chapter managed to break through the walls of desperate resistance. The Knights of Lupus were prepared for such a turn of events, and had previously rolled out cages of their mad collection. Such a variety of great beasts gathered in one place might not have been seen by any representative of the world of Caliban before. Monsters of all kinds bared their fangs and claws, anticipating when all the aforementioned would sink into their victims. To say that the Knights of the Order were surprised would be an understatement. However, they decided that dying by the great beast wasn't such a cruel fate after all. Shouting, "For the lion!" they continued their attack. Meanwhile, the Knights of Lupus released their entire menagerie from a safe distance, thanks to a complex mechanism. Crashing into the disorganized ranks of the chapter, the monsters tore the knights apart like paper soldiers, with a crunch and innards flying in every direction. In the first minutes of the attack, about a dozen of the lion's best followers perished. However difficult it was, they managed to cope. And Lion decided that no one deserved pity after such a dishonorable act. It was decided to obliterate everyone from the Knights of Lupus. But then, when Lion caught up with Lord Sartan, the head of all this chaos, the latter, smirking maliciously, decided to outplay the Primarch and plunged a dagger into his own heart. Then he learned the main lesson of his life. If a fight is inevitable, and even if there won't be a fight at all, it's always better to strike first. After killing all the survivors, Lion L. Johnson marked the complete purge of the world and the unification of the Caliban's lands. It's worth noting, despite Luther's significant contribution to this battle, all the glory somehow ended up going solely to the Lion, who accepted the congratulations with unhidden joy. This greatly irritated the first lieutenant. Before the Lion's arrival on the Promised Land, Luther was the best in everything, and would undoubtedly play a leading role in any other world. Thus, the first seeds of betrayal and the first instances of disobeying orders were sown. The Lion ordered the destruction of Sartan's library, where there was information on summoning demons, But Luther disobeyed and kept a book or two for himself, beginning to study them quietly. When the emperor arrived on Caliban, he did everything grandly and pompously, not setting up any solo meetings, but standing in the forefront and cut down the forest. Let's just say such reforms did not please all the local residents. Therefore, it was decided to kill the emperor. However, thanks to not very loyal individuals like Zahariel, who didn't like this movement, the conspiracy was thwarted and the guilty were punished. Subsequently, it was decided to reformat Caliban into the homeworld of the Astartes, initiating the transformation of the local youths into space marines. And the older men who wished to contribute to the martial cause were made into semi-Astartes, and Luther was among them. Although the Lion made no distinction as to whether you were an outstanding Astartes or a pathetic parody thereof, Luther nonetheless harboured a grudge. Remember, the Lion was not the most sociable among the Primarchs. Thus, as soon as he met his sons from Terra, of whom there were 500, he continued to foster a culture of silence around them. As they were superhumans, they quickly adapted, forming a sort of inner circle aptly named the 500. They began to study this unprecedented creature, compiling a special Lion Codex in which his deeds, methods and work analyses would be recorded. In essence, they slowly assembled the puzzle to better understand their Primarch, striving to stay close to him lest they miss anything. Thus, unconsciously, they organized what resembled a personal guard. It's also crucial to understand that the Lion was found 12th, meaning his legion was scattered across various theatres of war that needed to be gathered and acquainted with their new figurehead. He personally gathered the scattered fragments of the Dark Angels. He acquired a Gloriana-class battleship named Invincible Reason and began his journey. Gathering the First Legion piece by piece, he met with each captain, and no, they didn't have heart-to-heart conversations about their battles. They fought, thus earning each other's respect. And once all these shards were gathered, he had about 100,000 Astartes under his command, whom he renamed the Dark Angels. One might think, however, that Lionel Johnson acted as a crude and soulless brute who knew only the language of force, but it was not so. Almost every legion was on the brink of ruin without their Primarch and his further teachings on how to live. The First Legion was no exception, engulfed in discord, having suffered greatly in a series of reckless campaigns and afflicted with the malaise of pride and vanity. So his legion needed a firm kick to put the braggarts in their place. Moreover, he unified the teachings of the First Legion with those of the world of Caliban into one, which the Dark Angels would henceforth follow. After defeating all the bosses in ceremonial duels, with one he fought for a full hour, the Primarch took on the title of Grand Master of the First Legion and of the Hexagrammaton's 6 wings: the Death Wing, Raven Wing, Dread Wing, Fire Wing, Iron Wing and Storm Wing. Before the Legion, the Lion made his final vow to his sons, and they, in turn, swore allegiance to their Primarch. Upon taking the vow, the Lion appointed new masters over each wing and formalized various unofficial orders in the style of Caliban's knightly orders. By this time, the recruits from his native world were ready, and the Lion quickly incorporated them into the Legion. The first move of the Lion was towards Carcassonne, which had since risen against the Ultramarines' garrison. The reorganized Dark Angels, under the command of the Lion, fought brilliantly, sweeping away any memories of their former humiliation and saving their Ultramarines' allies from defeat. It is worth noting that even though the Dark Angels were in disarray before the arrival of Lion, the Emperor had understood from the very beginning of their existence that they were to play a leading role. The First Legion wasn't just the first, it was the top Legion, meaning it served as a kind of example, and perhaps even a template for the others. The future Dark Angels watched other legions taking their first steps, showing them how it should be done and watching to ensure they didn't do anything unnecessary. And for example, should the Space Wolves, conditionally speaking, do something wrong, then the First Legion would not only be the first they saw, but also the last. They had not only the moral right to do so, that is, forgive me, to exterminate, but also the technological means. In a case of emergency, the Primarch was to activate the purge mode and destroy whatever they were ordered to. For this reason, by the way, the Dark Angels did not have many adepts from the Mechanicum of Mars. Instead of them, the Legion used their cousins, the Smiths from Terra. Lion L. Johnson is directly the answer why the Mechanicum did not rise up with all their technological might and take control of the Imperium. They would have simply been annihilated, and Lion would have led that annihilation. And what does this mean? It means that Lion was specifically endowed with selfish qualities which do not care about the opinion of others. At first glance, the Lion might seem like an arrogant man, but this behavior is a forced form, because how are you going to exterminate someone you've once become attached to? What did he look like? He wore elegant power armor under the not-so-original name Lion Armor, but the real highlight of this set was the helmet. The Lion helm had a force field that protected the head. Now it has more of a ceremonial value, as it's passed from head to head of the newly minted Masters of the Chapter. Now the Lion helm has been handed down to the Supreme Grand Master Azrael. He wields the Lion Sword. The sword glows with a dim light, and everything it cleaves ultimately ignites. There was an occasion when this sword was knocked from the sturdy hands of the Primarch by Leman Russ himself, but thereafter, Lion did not commit such errors again. However, it was later broken by Guilliman for violating a vow once given to Sanguinius, and is now used as a piece of souvenir by Cypher. Before the Lion Sword, he actively used the Wolf Blade, a massive ancient chainsword which Lion found on his homeworld of Caliban and used until the Emperor gave him a present. He carried with him a plasma blaster and even stasis grenades. But all these were light options. When necessary, he could always raid his own armory, stuffed with goodies of Dark Age of technology, and literally destroy not only the body, but also the soul of his enemy. The first and possibly most famous campaign of extermination was the Rangdan Xenocides, when Lion, during the Second and Third Wars with varying success, pressed the main threat at that time to humanity. However, in the Third War, Lion was also possibly guilty of participating not only in the Rangdan Xenocides, but also in the disappearance of the 2nd and 11th Legions in particular. And if we combine one with the other, their unquestioning execution of orders and the fact of the absence in the current Imperium of 2 unknown legions, one can conclude that the Dark Angels are not so innocent. But considering his ambition to become the War Master, all the blame could have been taken by Leman Russ. Lion very much wanted to become the War Master, and here the Games Workshop created some inconsistencies. As much as the authors try to make him out to be a guy who doesn't care about anyone, we see that this is not the case. He literally melted when someone spoke of how great he was. Guilliman even confessed that he revered Lion so much he was great. What is there to say? Even Horus was stunned when he was chosen for the position of War Master instead of Lion. It's true that afterwards, Guilliman in other books breaks the sword in front of Lion and tells him that the word of the Lord of the First Legion is not worth it, but this is not important. The Games Workshop folk simply needed to urgently elevate Lion and make him the best of the best. A little spoiler, by the way, he is the strongest Primarch in the board game. Continuing on the subject of the Rangdan Xenocides, we recall how Alpharius himself, under the guise of another Alpharius, but not a Primarch since the real Alpharius had yet to be officially found, made his way there. So, the Alpharius, who was not quite Alpharius, hinted that there was a need to conclude matters with the Rangdans and to pass the reins of command of this company to others. He implied that he does not doubt him, but predicted Lion to get bogged down in that war, and reminded that others, such as Horus and Guilliman, were more proficient to become the first contender for the position of a warrior. To which Lion replied that he would not back down and would fight till the end. After destroying the accursed Rangdans, the Lion had to spend a long time rebuilding the Legion's strength to continue earning experience points. However, he could no longer surpass the achievements of the previously mentioned Guilliman and Horus. The time has passed, and this slightly perturbed the Lion. He simply claimed that he and his Legion were the best, that in stealth they could easily outmaneuver the Night Lords, and in siege warfare they could outplay the Imperial fists along with the Iron Warriors. But alas, this is understood by him alone, and the entire Imperium is too foolish to realize this undeniable truth. Indeed, he does not need this recognition. Where did you get that idea? And after all, warrior titles are just given to fools, Horus being proof. Nevertheless, it would be incorrect to regard Horus as having become a warrior simply because the lion was a bit unlucky with Rangda. No, of course, besides martial achievements, a future galactic warlord must possess necessary qualities. But alas, either nature or the Emperor himself deprived Lion El'Jonson of these qualities. What Horus did not lack, however, was charm and charisma. After his authoritative speeches, not just people, but Astartes from other legions were ready to go to hell, which some of them did a bit later, for the accomplishment of the goals set forth by the Lupercal. Of course, Astartes trembled when nearby Lion El'Jonson and his Dark Angels were also ready to give their lives, but the effect was still not the same. The utmost Lion was capable of was to honour the warrior host with his silent presence and, likewise in silence, depart for battle. And no, he wasn't so heartless. He felt pity for his legion too, and understood perfectly well that they strived for him. However, he was not able to express his feelings, let alone spread them beyond the boundaries of his legion. If we set aside Lion's solo actions and recall the old books, we will learn that Lion rather coolly accepted the fact that Horus had become War Master. He was not pleased, and moreover, I will say, was displeased with such a personnel decision, but did not have mass hysterics, unlike other Primarchs. Interestingly, his close friend from the Space Wolves named Leman Russ almost similarly received this news. He was emotionally connected to him at least, since he actually interacted more with Gilliman and Conrad Kurz, but we'll talk about that a bit later. With the Wolf King, there was a conflict of interest. It would be fair to tell this story, but from the perspective of Lion El'Jonson. Sometime during the Great Crusade, the Dark Angels and the Space Wolves assaulted the planet Dulan, whose ruled the independent Farsh Empire. In addition to disrespecting the Emperor, the leader of the rebels had also insulted Leman Russ personally by naming him the Emperor's lapdog. In response, Leman Russ swore that he would cut the rebel leader's head from his shoulders and demanded that he be allowed to make an immediate attack on the rebels' headquarters. This impatient request was refused because the Lion had spent days gathering intelligence on the headquarters' defences and had planned a detailed assault of his own. The Dark Angel attack went forward with few casualties, and Russ could only watch from the grounds as Lion El'Jonson killed the rebel leader high on the walls of the fortress. And where were the wolves, you might ask? Could it be that the Dark Angels conducted a special operation faster than the representatives of the Vulca Fenrica? Not quite. Leman Russ had to step aside. So, did Lion kill the king not because he so wanted to steal Russ's glory, but because Russ did not stick to the previously established plan? Lion was merely fulfilling the task to quickly end this campaign by the order of the higher-ups from Terra. Despite all this absurdity, their legions have been calling each other out to ceremonial duels for 10,000 years. Besides the fact that Lion could not at all read human emotions, there was also a likelihood that he did not understand sarcasm. Despite possessing a great strategic mind, he was incapable of planning for the long term. Once, in the company of Sarosh, Leon almost met his demise when one of the High Lords cunningly managed to smuggle a nuclear bomb not just anywhere but onto the flagship of the Primarch, the Invincible Intellect. Were it not for Luther's conscience in the person of Zahariel, the ruler of the First Legion would not have seen the light of day. However, upon learning of this adventure that his deputy allowed this to happen, Lion suffered a nervous breakdown, as a result of which he banished Luther to Caliban. This decision was difficult for him. However, Luther was on the verge of betrayal, and the situation seems ambiguous. On one hand, we see Luther, who eventually came to his senses and realized the folly of his actions, and on the other, one can understand Lion, for who knows what other thought might arise in the mind of his comrade, and he might decide to kill his favourite Primarch but a bit later. Sending him back home was not quite a punishment. This way, Lion demonstrated that he still trusted Luther, entrusting him with the recruitment of new initiates from the former Death World. He demonstrated trust, but forgot to say, and Luther took it in his own way, regretting 10 times that he did not let Lion explode. In moments of anger, of course. Although Luther was a step away from betrayal at this moment, without certain events, deep down inside, he was still loyal to Lionel Johnson. As for when Lion matured and became established as a Primarch, we can talk about his appearance and character. In a solo piece about the Lord of the First, we are told that Lion resembles his father. That is the Emperor, more than anyone. Moreover, it is written there that he was the only one who could approximately discern the true face of the Golden Throne's occupant. With a minor caveat, he saw only a figure in a hood in emerald armor, enshrouded in an indistinct light. Lion was also reticent. In the rare moments when he managed to meet with his father, they hardly spoke. What one wanted to say, the other sometimes understood even without words. What was better left unsaid remained unspoken. The Lion always maintained a standard of high expectations, and thus always demanded flawless execution of his orders from his warriors. It was impossible to argue with him. A single glance from him was enough to halt any objection. In this way, he ended protests from Magnus, who wished to preserve the artifacts of a world. And let's not even mention Horus, who at times regretted engaging in discussions with Lion. To be more specific, the Lion is somewhat like a blend of Mortarion and Perturabo, but with intelligence and courage. He is in many ways a mirror and opposite to his brother, Lemon Russ. If on the outside Russ appears uncultured, inside he is a cunning strategist, hiding it all behind a facade. Conversely, the Lion hides a wild beast of the Calibanite forests behind his noble knightly appearance. When the Horus heresy unfolded, the Lion was deeply grieved. Grieved because it had not happened sooner, and now he saw his chance to become the new War Master. All this against a backdrop of indifference to all, as he deemed himself too formidable regardless. Between the 3rd and 5th Istvan, the Lion took part in the Shieldweld campaign, where he fought against the Gordian League. His presence there was no coincidence. Horus, exploiting his position, had scattered his potentially most dangerous brothers across the edges of the galaxy to preclude their interference. Upon learning of the treachery, the Lion attempted to construct a logical sequence that if Horus were not stopped at the outskirts of the solar system, he would likely then lay siege to Terra. So, what to do? Correct, prevent him from acquiring siege weaponry, and if he lacked the tools, he would not be able to take Terra. Admiring his own strategic genius, the Lion set out with a small band of dark angels to the forge world of Diamat to requisition the local toys so they wouldn't fall into the hands of the Lupercal. According to unverified information, these were not mere futuristic catapults and trebuchets, but the genuine Ordinatus, the most powerful weapons in the entire galaxy capable of atomizing small cities, though this is not certain. And you know what? He succeeds. The galactic tactic worked, and the foolish Horus was outplayed. Remember, I told you the Lion was no good with people. So, upon his return to Macragge, the Lion encounters Perturabo, who supposedly was on his way to fight Edel the traitor at the 5th Istvan. The brilliant strategist, in addition to defeating Horus, decided to advance further, outplay Horus not just tactically, but also in a career sense, taking his prestigious position as a warrior. The Primarch of the most secluded and calculating legion during wartime negotiates with Perturabo that he will give him the siege weaponry in exchange for a vote, which he will cast in favor of the Iron Warrior's Lord when the time comes to elect the new Supreme Commander. And here several questions arise all at once. Since when do warriors elect their leaders through democratic vote? That's the first thing. Secondly, there's a theory that the Lion knew all along to whom he was giving the weapons and acted according to his personal plan. But who are we kidding? Lionel Johnson likely had no inkling and thus simply passed the siege weapon onto the master of siege warfare. Nothing more. After such a fortuitous deal, Lionel Johnson journeyed to Terra to negotiate with the Emperor, pointing out the mistake of having appointed Horus to the position instead of himself. However, Horus foresaw this and sent a restless careerist by the name of Conrad Kurz to distract the Son of the Forest from his voyage to Old Earth, and he succeeded in doing so. Thus began the Thramas campaign, where the Night Lords, through genocide and attacks on imperial worlds, delayed the Dark Angels for as long as 3 years. Kurz decided to personally communicate with Lion, setting up a special beacon that was to summon the Primarch to a meeting. The Night Haunter wanted to break his former brother either morally, physically, or both to achieve his own ends. On the planet Sagualsa, the two brothers finally met, where Kurz began taunting Lion about the grim future of him and his warriors. They would be regarded as traitors, and trust in them would be non-existent. Essentially, you are not loyal to the Imperium, but will simply side with the victor. "You are opportunists," Kurz exclaimed venomously. However, Lion struck Kurz with his counter-argument, plunging his lion sword into the gaunt body of the Night Hunter, which greatly shocked him, as he was not prepared for someone to use underhanded tactics against him. Shocked, but not surprised, for how else to explain the fact that Kurz did not drop dead, but instead lunged at the lion and nearly strangled the wretch. Korsvan, observing the unfair fight where the battle was one-on-one, decided to interfere and rectify this misunderstanding. With a swift motion of his hand, as taught by the Primarch, he too drove his sword into Conrad's exposed back. Dragging away the embittered Primarchs, each vowed to return and thoroughly thrash his opponent. Lion even swore not to return to Terra until he avenged himself upon the Night Lords. Somewhere Horus smirked malevolently. 3 years later, in the Battle of the Thalax, Lion requisitioned an artifact, settling the dispute over who it would belong to between the Iron Hands and the Death Guard under the command of Typhus. The Tukulka engine, which was part of a triumvirate of similar sentient devices, with the Ouroboros being another, and the third, an unnamed engine, which together could create temporal rifts connecting space and time. He decided to use it to perform a warp jump. And then trouble. While they were in the Immaterium, they were surrounded by demons. What to do, he thought. How about this, librarian? Strike it with a fireball. It works. Well then, I'm declaring that the Dark Angel henceforth uses not warp powers, but the useful extrasensory powers of the ancestors of Caliban. However, Legion Chaplain Nemiel, brother of Zahariel, was extremely displeased with such an act, and even wanted to challenge the Primarch, stating that he was not only endangering the entire Legion by using warp forces against demons, but also contesting the orders of the Emperor himself. At first, the Lion wanted to respond, but the report became clear as, unexpectedly, the Lion simply beheaded the chaplain. Why he did this, let's ask the author himself. Gav Thorpe replies that in this way he decided to show that the Horus Heresy series has the character, meaning that if a character has a name, it doesn't guarantee they'll always be saved by plot armor. At the climax of tensions, Slanesh's Weaver, a Grand Zench demon, came to lure the Primarch to the side of the ruinous powers. Nonetheless, he had nothing to offer to. Lion shows the demon that he was utterly devoted to the Emperor and considered loyalty his own reward. The Lion dismisses the Lord of Change, piercing his heart and asking whether the Grand Demon had anticipated this. The Tukulka engine still provides an advantage to the Dark Angels, even allowing them to ambush the maniac. Thrashing the fools, he forces the progeny to flee, who miraculously manage to rescue the Primarch's half-dead body. A little later, the Night Lords fall into an ambush for the second time, and Kurzi, now awakened from a comatose sleep, has to retreat to the flagship of Lionel Johnson. It seemed that the pitiful bug had fallen into a trap, but that was not the case. Kurz felt at home on the dark decks and calmly defeated the chapters that Lion sent for his soul. The Lion also went hunting, however. Conrad's sharp eye and his foresight always helped him emerge dry from water over the course of 16 weeks. Theoretically, the Lion had avenged the Night Lords, with a casualty ratio of 1 to 4. At 40,000 killed Night Lords, the Dark Angels lost only 10,000, and technically Kurtze was now imprisoned by the Lion. Regardless of his ability to move freely, it could be assumed that the promise was fulfilled, and it was time to return to Terra to receive further orders from the Emperor. But the trouble was, due to the warp storms stirred up by the vile Lorgar and his followers from the Word-Bearers, organized to spite the Loyalists, it was impossible to undertake a safe warp journey. What to do? Who knows? Let's fly towards some unknown light and see where the troops end up. And indeed, they reached Ultramar. The light turned out to be the Pharos beacon set up by Robuta Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines. Upon the arrival of the Dark Angels, everyone was tense, both the Ultramarines and the Dark Angels. The former were tense because these were the Dark Angels. Even if Guilliman trembled before the Lion, however, in the reputable literature by Dan Abnett, the Lord of Ultramar did not trust anyone, especially not the Dark Angels. And the latter were strained because Lion L. Johnson did not particularly appreciate the fact that Robuta Guilliman devoted so much time to his mini-empire. And now, what he sees, while war rages everywhere, Guilliman is fortifying his positions. It's no sin to confess Lion saw a threat in Guilliman no less than he saw in Horus. Lion was loyal only to the Emperor and would not tolerate if anyone else claimed his place. It's a curious fact in the tale The Board is Set. The piece representing the lion was in the form of a double-edged sword, which could be interpreted in various ways. Of course, some of you might say that it symbolized he could become either a loyalist or a follower of chaos. But it rather hinted that Lion was a danger to all Primarchs, and he could become a scourge for both the traitors and for those followers of the Emperor who weren't careful enough. Nevertheless, everything turned out without excessive bloodshed. Guilliman, although not pleased with such a meeting, Lion L. Johnson too did not want to stain his hands without cause at this moment. Lion joined forces with his brother to continue the resistance against the forces of evil. Guilliman, naturally, expressed his gratitude for dispersing their worry by bringing to their planet a spy who almost undermined the Primarchs, if not for a miracle in the form of the Imperial Fist Alexis Pollux and the Iron Warrior Barabbas Dantioch's tandem. Such a union could be called nothing short of miraculous. Moving away from the terroristic acts in Kersey, the two lords discussed further plans of action. Flying to Terra was not just impossible, it was literally unfeasible. The storm was of such might that it would have swept away two massive fleets of Primarchs immediately. Thus the cunning Guilliman proposed to prepare for the worst-case scenario. Terra has fallen and the Emperor is dead. They needed a new leader, and it would be Sanguinius, who arrived just in time. After they had appointed the new Emperor of Imperium Secundus, they remembered the deceased Vulcan and sent him back home to Nocturne, in a direction where travel was still possible. A triumvirate was created, where Lion finally achieved his dream and became a lesser version of a warrior, the Lord Protector of Imperium Secundus, and Guilliman became the Prime Minister under Emperor Sanguinius. The tandem, let me tell you, my respects. Here you immediately have both a good logistician and an excellent military leader, and importantly, Imperium Secundus had a symbol of hope in the form of an angel. However, everyone annoyed each other equally. Guilliman was annoyed that these two monstrosities arrived at his world, and now there was utter chaos. Lion was annoyed that he missed Kurs, and that Sanguinius did practically nothing but lament about his harsh fate. And Sanguinius was irritated that the others did not understand him, not allowing him to come to terms with himself. Seething with anger, Lion L. Johnson, as the High Commander of the local forces, declared martial law, gathered all necessary documentation to authorize the release of the Ravenwing and the Deathwing to hunt down Conrad Kurs. However, before this action, he had promised not to be too cruel and to refrain from using orbital bombardment, an assurance to which the Lion merely winked and indicated he understood the hint. I must tell you, Lion L. Johnson was never adept at reading people. Essentially, Lion L. Johnson interpreted the caution as merely these two not wanting to dirty their hands, but no matter, Lion L. Johnson would do it for them. The master of the traitors was hiding in the mountains, where he found suitable company among the local chaos worshippers who had settled there long before, but had remained hidden for an extended period. Conrad Kurs terrorized everyone through intermediaries, including civilians and Astartes, but his tricks eventually began to repeat themselves. Lion L. Johnson switched to Predator-Dominator mode, harshly quelled the mountain uprising and cornered his prey, Conrad Kurs, while Leman Russ dragged the tied-up Conrad Kurs to Sanguinius and Robuta Guilliman, suggesting that they dispose of Kurs summarily without trial. These two were greatly displeased by such methods, resulting in Sanguinius banishing Lion L. Johnson from the new Imperium, and Gilliman breaking his sword for not keeping his vow to avoid excessive violence. A few hours later, Lionel Johnson was ready to depart Macragge for Caliban when suddenly an epiphany struck. He must urgently return to the planet, and having ostentatiously teleported back, Lionel Johnson discovered that Sanguinius was about to behead the unfortunate Conrad Kurz. However, he stopped him, informing that since Kurz had a vision that he would be killed by an assassin sent by the Emperor, it meant the Emperor was still alive. Moreover, he knelt to ask Sanguinius to spare Conrad Kurz's life, swearing not to harm him on a whim, but to protect him from any dangers, including from himself. Sanguinius accepted this arrangement, and the trio set off in search of a safe path to Terra. However, later on, to define who he was and what he should do next, Sanguinius convinced his brothers to accompany him to Davin, where Kurz would be kidnapped to be used as a portable device for predicting the future. This infuriated Lionel Johnson to the point of wanting to exterminate the world where Kurz and Sanguinius were located. But he abruptly changed his mind, realizing that someone was cleverly manipulating them, wanting a primeval entity to emerge from the Primarch and destroy everything around. After minor events, when Sanguinius learned he must urgently reach Terra, the trio split up. Gilliman took over the fleet that had been stalking them all this time to delay the army of loyal Primarchs. Sanguinius had to rush to defend the throne world, and Lionel Johnson departed to do what he does best, destroy the homeworlds of the traitorous Primarchs. But why engage in such an endeavour? The answer is straightforward: to distract the renegades and compel them to redirect their gaze towards defending their homeworld. However, all efforts were in vain, the stakes were too high, and the souls of the traitors had already been corroded by corruption, which cared neither for their own Astartes nor for the homeworlds they hailed from. They remained indifferent to the destruction of their birthplaces and refused to leave Terra. It seemed all was for naught, especially since the light of the Astronomicon did not reach the fleet of the Lion, rendering it impossible even to ascertain whether the Emperor was alive or had fallen to the advance of Horus. What was to be done? The decision was made to convene a gathering, attended by all from the Masters of the Orders to the mortal officers of the ship's crew. All except for Lionel Johnson. Realizing that the Lion might be suffering from prolonged depression, the meeting commenced without him, paying homage to the empty throne of the warlord. A genuine verbal battle ensued, with a heated argument flaring up. One particularly audacious officer even hurled a stool at an Astartes, when suddenly Lion himself appeared on the throne. The cunning one had outplayed them all, understanding that his presence from the beginning would have led the Astartes to grovel before him. All this time, lying in wait, he listened to the boldest of statements and assumptions. The truth, however, concerning the outcome of this meeting remains unknown to us. But one thing we do indeed know for certain: the Lion arrived on Terra only after its siege, when the Emperor had ascended to the throne, while Horus's body was being devoured by the Emperor's children. Nevertheless, a portion of the Chaos followers still defiled the throne world with their presence. Hence, by uniting with the remnants of the Blood Angels, White Scars and the Imperial Fists, as well as the recently arrived Leman Russ, with the Space Wolves, the valiant warriors cleansed Terra of the last Chaos follower. It turns out a bit earlier, the Lion and Russ had encountered each other somewhere near the solar system, or in another place, and upon Russ's recommendation, annihilated any presence of Chaos forces. All of this delayed them, and they were unable to save the Emperor. Therefore, it was indeed Leman who was blamed for the Emperor's seating on the Golden Throne, for which he was to be punished. However, Russ had no intention of fighting, and in the moment the frenzied Lion lunged at him with a sword. The Primarch of the Space Wolves calmly bared his hairy chest, not flinching from the blow. Only when the blade pierced his primary heart did Lion realize the horror of his actions, and only through tactical genius and masterful handling of the blade was he able to spare the secondary heart. Leman Russ awoke, finding himself in bed. The Lord of Fenris saw Dawn and El Johnson above him. The Lion approached his brother and bowed his head, asking for forgiveness, which Russ gladly granted. Assembled together, The three Primarchs made a solemn vow to never again fight amongst themselves. As for Guilliman, no such vow was extended, adding another reason to speculate that someone's end might be nigh in the 40th millennium. And seemingly at such a wonderful moment, full of sentiments, it would have been fitting to conclude the tale of the lion, but no, the story continues. As the Horus heresy came to a conditional end, the lion returned home, back to Caliban. Yet what he saw did not please him in the slightest. Caliban bristled with weaponry against its master, and, pardon the pun, opened fire without calibration. This broke the lion's heart so deeply that he ordered the traitors to be punished. Not leaving a stone upon a stone of the defensive fortifications, the lion personally landed on the world, to cut the throat of resistance and to look Luther, who dared to betray his unflinchingly loyal brother, in the eyes. As soon as they met, a true battle began. The planet was aflame with explosions cracking apart, and two titans of war readied themselves for a deadly duel. Luther put up a worthy resistance, having levelled up his skills through secret knowledge. Also, he had secured the support of the dark gods, who had lent him a bit of their strength. Nonetheless, no matter how skilled Luther was, by nature he remained a mere human. The Primarch predictably won, but suddenly the lion hesitated and could not deliver the finishing blow. As if in a flashback from movies, memories of happy days spent together surfaced in his mind. How splendidly they had hunted great beasts. How wonderfully they had forced rebellious orders to peace. How they had accidentally burned a village along with its peasants for the first time. All this prevented the lion from killing Luther. However, Luther used this hesitation and struck the Primarch with a lightning bolt, grievously wounding him. Suddenly the scales fell from Luther's eyes, and he realized the full extent of his actions. The truth shattered his sanity, and he fell next to Johnson, no longer wishing to fight. The gods, apparently disappointed in their pawn, created a gigantic warp storm, which sucked in all evidence and scattered the now fallen dark angels across the galaxy and through time. Descending in a rescue team, the Primarch was nowhere to be found on the devastated planet. Only his former deputy Luther was found, repeating over and over that when the lion returns he will forgive him for everything. Now he lies deep in the shard of his native world. It's not entirely clear whether he sleeps or is in stasis. His condition is such that the creators of Folks can change his state at any moment to suit the narrative. So, what should one read about Lion L. Johnson? We delve into the Primarch series, reading about Lion L. Johnson, Lord of the First. The other books partially reveal his character. These include Descent of Angels, Fallen Angels, Angels of Caliban, The Unremembered Empire, and Dreadwing. The books are listed not in order, but as we recalled them. He might be the next Primarch after Guilliman, as he is the second Primarch whose whereabouts are known to us. Details will likely become clearer after the last book of the Siege of Terra series, which will reveal the decisions made at the Council following the destruction of the traitor's homeworld and how exactly the Emperor was enthroned. Of course, this will be further elucidated upon the release of the 10th edition Codex. The Anniversary Codex is expected to shake the community, at least with the return of a loyal Primarch. And it should only be Lion L. Johnson. Who will awaken the lion? Here we have two possibilities, and in each the Watchers in the Dark play a role as they are currently keeping an eye on him from the shadows. The first involves Cypher, since he carries the broken sword known as the Lion Sword. The second and closest to our view involves the Luther, who, in hope of saving his own soul, in exchange for forgiveness, will assist Lion L. Johnson in awakening. What does the return of the lion entail? Make no mistake, it spells conflict not with chaos, but as we've repeatedly mentioned, with Guilliman and his stewardship over the Imperium. What can we conclude? Is Lion L. Johnson an interesting Primarch? It would be a lie if we said no. At first, he may seem like a capricious and stubborn Primarch, but that's just at first glance. The folks at Games Workshop managed to embed in him a puzzle that the reader can solve for themselves after a long reading of the books dedicated to the Primarch and his Dark Angels. Of course, there are times when he seems naive, while at other times he engages in complex schemes with motives known only to the Emperor himself. There's an attempt to portray him as a genius sociophobe who, while he loves his brothers, prefers to do so from a distance. Lion may have been one of the few Primarchs who truly understood their nature, as warp-filled beings created solely for war and overcoming challenges, and this profoundly influenced him, changing his perception of himself and his brothers.